It is Friday, November 8th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another professional episode of LTPS. We have PlayStation 5 Pro now finally available, so we've got a lot of stories about that, and then Sony earnings later in the show as well. So first, as always, a very brief reminder for the PS Plus Essential November lineup, which is now live on PSN, so you can go ahead and claim those games. And also, we do know about one PS Plus Premium Classic title probably coming fairly soon, that being Alone in the Dark 2 on PS1, so that showed up on the PSN backend as well. So that's probably one of the 3, 4, or 5 games that we're going to get for this coming month on Premium. Moving on to our first news story, Sony has confirmed the existence of that PS5 Slim console bundle coming out on November 22nd. This console is going to have 1,000 V-Bucks packed in and also a download code for 8 different cosmetics. The reason why this is pertinent info is because, if you remember, this was reported on by Bilbo Kuhn writing for Deal Labs, where initially this would be a console that Sony would offer for this holiday season, but it would also be on sale for Black Friday, where this would be the lowest price we've ever seen a console offered from Sony for the PlayStation 5 generation. So a digital edition console is going to go on sale for $374.99, and then a disc console for $24.99 USD. So typically $25 less than what we normally see, which is usually a $50 price cut if they do ever run sales on the console. So I imagine they will either announce the price right away when the console is available on the 22nd, alongside all their other Black Friday deals, or there will be a short window where the console is just immediately available for, let's say, $500, then goes on sale right after. I would have to guess that by the time they actually put this thing up on PS Direct, it will be the Black Friday sale. So just keep that in mind if you're in the market for a standard PS5 console, because that is the lowest price for a new model, 1-year warranty from Sony, and it's Fortnite, so you can tell how they're trying to sell a boatload of these things for the holiday season. So just keep that in mind if you are in the market. Moving on to Ballistic Moon's PS5 and PC remake of Until Dawn, where recently a new patch got sent out, 1.06. Only on PlayStation 5 right now. PC should be a little bit later, but it does address a number of issues that the game had on day one. But more importantly, it also offers a performance mode finally as well. So there's actually performance and fidelity modes with base PS5 and PS5 Pro support. So presumably Pro, you're just seeing more consistent, higher frame rates, maybe a higher resolution. I don't think there's any testing done on the new patch just yet, but this should be a lot better. That was the most polarizing thing about the game coming out, is that it was capped at 30, and then just all these other issues clearly. But this is not an uncommon thing with some game studios, in that it was very clear this stuff was all on the roadmap and they wanted to include it in the game. But it's a deadline, and it seems like they just did not really have any sort of breathing room from SIE to, delay the game another month or so, which means they had to ship the game in that state, and here we are now. So not a great circumstance. I would have liked to see them just hold off on the game and really spruce it up, make sure it ships in a proper state, and also get a good build on the disc. But at least we do have the game in what appears to be a much better spot now versus what it was at launch. Next up, let's talk about LEGO Horizon Adventures, coming out very soon, November 14th, next week. And we do know the embargo is set for the 13th, so one day prior to the game coming out, which I can't imagine the game is going to review bad per se, probably in the neighborhood of like 7s, 8s, just kind of a good, fun LEGO game. I would have to assume that's probably what's going to happen. But we are hearing from Tom Henderson, writing for Insider Gaming. He actually just put this out over on Twitter, but he mentioned that he's hearing the game is relatively short, around 6 hours for the main story, and then 15-ish for the Platinum. So something where it's not really as long as what you typically see from a lot of other LEGO entries. I know for some, they're actually kind of annoying to Platinum. They're like upwards of 30 to 40, 50 hours. I mean, there's a lot of LEGO games now at this point, but I know a lot of them actually can get up there as far as trying to do and see everything, to where they're kind of a nuisance and they overstay their welcome. If you do go for the Platinum Gold path, not nearly as bad. But I will say, hearing this, my interest has peaked even more so. I always wanted to play the game. LEGO Horizon, awesome, then I'm on board. But if it was like a 20-something plus hour game, I'm like, I can kind of wait on that, especially with how much that's in the backlog right now. PS5 Pro's out, so we're just testing a lot of different games and everything. But now hearing that, I'm like, oh, it's a weekend-style game. Now I might actually jump in sooner rather than later. So at least in my view, I find that actually helps the game to just sort of have this short burst of fun, and it doesn't really overstay its welcome. So I really gravitate towards that kind of stuff nowadays. All right, moving on to some PlayStation 5 Pro coverage because the console is now finally out there. Sony's brand new mid-cycle PS5 souped-up hyper console, and we do know for day one there was like 55 something games that Sony outlined prior that were going to get patches on day one, just slightly over what we saw with PS4 Pro, but I believe that number is already inaccurate because there's just been so many games on a rolling basis getting updates, or rather the developer at least confirming that they will have an update available, and sometimes they don't even know when that patch is going to go live on PSN, or sometimes they find out last minute. So I believe the list that Sony put out and also the directory on the store is not going to be completely accurate as far as like what does have a proper PS5 Pro enhancement. So this is just one of those things where I will defer people to checking out the links below because that Reddit list is still being updated. That's just a bird's eye view of the games that do have enhancements, so not confirmed as far as like which ones are available now and which ones aren't, but that's showing up to like 99 or 100 something games. And then over on Reset Era, a new thread is being worked on right now. That's cataloging like everything, a very thorough list, not just showing off the games that have enhancements, but what the enhancements are, what they look like compared to the base console. So really good handy tool if you want to dive further into the kind of games that you might want to end up playing on the Pro, and I'll leave all that stuff linked down below. Now, of course, one of the issues with PlayStation 5 Pro is that the console is not being sold bundled in with a disk drive option. You can buy that separately, and that is something you can do if you want to go out and do that, but the issue becomes, well, that might not be a viable option depending on where you live. So here in the US, it's typically not been a problem. So for months now, the drive has been available. It might have gone out of stock one or two times, but for the most part, stock allocation, not really a problem here in North America, unsurprisingly. But in the UK, and I think other parts of Europe as well, it's been actually really tough. It's been out of stock for a long time. That naturally leads to scalping on eBay. So it usually has an RRP of like £100 sterling. Now it's up there for 200, 300, 400 pounds sterling, which is obviously annoying. A very bad indirect consequence of having the drive being sold separately. It's like, okay, in theory you can go out and buy it, but not really if it's out of stock. So I would hope that the company does solve this very soon and get more units sent out to the UK and everywhere that does need it, because if you are, say, a really engaged customer and you're willing to drop this kind of cash on a PS5 Pro day one, but if you're coming from a CFI 1000 series model where you can't easily move your drive over just for a brief period and you primarily play physical games, like, you're out of luck. You can't actually buy and play your games on this new console. So hopefully they do fix this fairly soon, because this is a really annoying consequence of only offering a digital edition. Moving on to the teardown of PS5 Pro, where we actually got this like 4 or 5 days ago, well before the console came out, because again, certain people got the console early. If they're not publications, they're not beholden to embargoes, so they're going to show a lot more than what we should have seen right away. But it looks like this one YouTube channel called Tag were able to tear the console down. They seem to be a console repair shop, so that would explain a lot. But before even diving into what we learned, we can say that when they took off the top panel, you can clearly see a new access bay for the CR2032 battery, which is awesome news. That is great for repairability, just in that anybody can really do this. It's not hard at all. That was always something where for the CR2032, I mean, it's almost always like next to the motherboard or like super deep into the console. You always have to take the entire shell apart, and it's a huge hassle. I mean, those batteries can last like 15, 20 something years, and they're only there to track time. Although in the case of PlayStation hardware, they're tracking the trophy timestamps as well, which not a massive issue on PS4 5. PS3, it is still a problem in that if your CR2032 battery dies on a PS3 and you can't go online, you cannot launch digital games. That's still a problem on PS3. The company has still not addressed that or sent out a firmware to fix it. They actually did fix that on PS4 5. But the point is, on PS5 Pro, you can change out that battery. Even further in, you can see it's like got its own little board and a wire runs off to it. So you can see how they tried to address that problem. So that is quite good. And it does seem to be very similar to the first PS5 revision, where that was the one where they, before the Slim, took out a lot of copper. And back then that was a bit of a controversy because it's like, oh, Sony, big manufacturer, taking out copper, which is expensive at the time, so they're getting down bill of materials. But the missing context at the time was also like, okay, but the console maybe was in a position where it was maybe a little over-engineered for its cooling, so they had that overhead to remove copper, and it was still within viable operating temps. There's a certain tolerance level that the console can still be designed in such a manner where it's not really a problem with the subsequent revisions, and that's what we've seen so far, and that's going into PS5 Pro as well. But the other news here, number 2, is that the SoC does appear to be smaller on possibly a 4 or 5 nanometer process. Not confirmed, but it would appear smaller versus 6 on PlayStation 5 Slim, and that would explain how this console is able to be the way that it is, given that it is more powerful on paper. So Sony does have to account for and worry about things like thermals, heat dissipation, the sheer size of the console, power output as well. So that might have been the way that they were able to offset these things in such a manner where all other aspects of cooling on the console is not really all that different compared to, again, the Slim or that first revision. All that stuff does seem very similar, so you have to assume it probably is a smaller process size, which is definitely good. That would imply, without having some thorough testing being done, that the console is not going to operate crazy high temperatures, and it's also a little bit future-proofed for some of the worst-case scenario games we'll see as the generation develops and we see more developers really push the hardware, so they always have to account for those worst-case scenario games. Power draw, obviously, which we know it's rated for 390 watts, which is more than what PS5, the first console, was rated at, which is 350. But the actual true operating average there is 200 to 210 watts, playing, again, really graphically intensive games. So PS5 Pro might still be in that same neighborhood. Again, no definitive testing, but it implies that the console is not going to be in this weird circumstance where, like PS4 Pro and standard PS4 consoles before it, that it's going to get crazy hot and loud and things like that. And we're already seeing that's not really the case. And it also, I would think, bodes well for Sony as far as fabrication, because that means they can make more per wafer, and that just implies further and further the console is very profitable at its $699 price tag, which for a low volume machine that they don't have to subsidize, yeah, they want to straight up make a profit on every PS5 Pro sold. So I would venture a guess and say that is looking quite good for Sony's bottom line. Now, another smaller benefit to PS5 Pro is that there's more usable storage on this console versus what we've seen with prior models. And there's some nuance here, obviously, because of course 2 terabytes is bigger than 1 terabyte or 825, but it's actually the reserve amount on the console which is different and actually showing a more accurate number. And that's the caveat here, because in a weird way, on the, let's say, 825 model, where the usable storage does show as 667, and then that reserves 158, and there's always going to be that reserve amount, right? Because you need that for background processes, firmware, operating system, that's not going to go away. But technically, from what we know, and this all is based on this sort of binary unit of measurement, because there's gigabits behind the scene, which is similar to gigabytes, but this is how people worked out initially that PS5, why they settled on 825 based on the 12 lanes in the for the SSD and everything. It's a sort of weird number, but we can figure out that the 667 in theory is not what should be the cap. It should be closer to 700 something gigabytes, but for whatever reason they show you the gigabit number, and that number is still a hard limit on what you can install in the console. You can't install past 667, so in theory the reserve amount should be closer to 110. And so the news here is that on PlayStation 5 Pro with 2 terabytes, the usable storage is indeed 1.89, so the reserve amount is down to the true 110 that you should have always been getting. I don't know why it's like this, or what the decision making was behind the scenes, or why it worked out this way. Because in theory, the other consoles should have slightly more usable storage. I guess the important thing that you need to know and worry about here is that you have an extra 48 something gigabytes that we otherwise didn't think was going to be accessible in this case. So you can install maybe one extra semi-large game, maybe a bunch of smaller games, on top of the much larger onboard storage the console has versus the prior models. All right, let's get into some PS5 Pro reviews, which are, going to read very similar across the board in that the console is undeniably better. That much is clear, but it does become a talking point of, how much value would you place on that in relation to the price of the console, which of course is very high. So there is a lot to be said there. We'll, of course, chime in eventually when I have enough hands-on time with the console. But what we do want to zero in on is the one aspect that we were able to look at initially a few days ago, which were some leaks early on of testing PS4 games on the console, 1080p non-PS4 Pro games on the console, because it does have a system-wide setting, a toggle you can turn on for enhancing the image quality of PS4 games. So for Digital Foundry's review, at least, where they're diving into more of the technical aspects of the console, we do have some early analysis on that setting, which there's not much else we really learned here, because Richard Ledbetter also came to a very similar conclusion in that it is some kind of post-process filter. He thinks possibly AI-based in nature, so there is a chance that there might be something a little bit proprietary here from Sony's point of view, but again, it could be like out of AMD's toolbox or something. The filter is still very surface level in terms of it feeding a 2D image into some kind of algorithm. So, it's not built on the game's engine, or it's not baked into the engine, I should say, getting access to things like motion vectors, models, how the scenery is laid out, and things like that. It's not PSSR or what we could see with NVIDIA DLSS. It's nothing like that. It's a very basic post-processing filter, but they do point out the very clear difference it can make on the UI or HUD elements, and apparently pixel art games can look pretty good too, but in some cases, for some games, if they already have a lot of post-processing effects, then the image it might spit out would actually be not ideal. So that would be games with like a film grain, maybe like an Order 1886, which I would be curious to see how that game looks, or games with just a lot of chromatic aberration. So there are some cases where you don't want to just turn that setting on, then leave it, forget it. You might actually get a worse experience based on the games. Very curious to try out a lot of 2013 to like early 2016 PS4 games that never saw a Pro enhancement, because the thing is, there's actually a number of games like well into PS4 Pro that also never got a Pro enhancement. So again, we're talking about like thousands of games. So it could look really good. Also, just kind of a nice thing to have thing is how Richard was putting it, because it really is not like a dramatic difference, but still want to try out a lot of titles and see what kind of results we can get. Now, the other aspect of this console, the one that will have the biggest difference for unpatched games, is just playing standard PS5 games without a Pro enhancement, where the console will boost those titles just retroactively. So Digital Foundry came in with some testing, and so a really good example here is Elden Ring, where the quality mode on PS5 can have a really rough fluctuating frame rate, always in like the 40s, but PS5 Pro can push it to nearly 60, which is remarkable given this really does illustrate just how unoptimized Elden Ring is on console. But it's still something where at least the game is now in the VRR window, so if you have a VRR display, then you can probably get a pretty smooth 60 experience now playing the PS5 native version of that game in quality mode. They also looked at Control's photo mode, where the frame rate is unlocked and they see like a 30% boost on average. So this was Digital Foundry trying to figure out if games can really tap into PS5 Pro unpatched and use that extra RT hardware on the Pro, but that does not seem to be the case. So 30% average, they're trying to see if they can get the 45 full something percent that Sony's been quoting for the actual on-paper improvement. Another example is Metaphor Refantasio. Seems like PS5 Pro is playing this game unpatched, and it's been holding a near lock 60, because that game also is kind of unstable. Final Fantasy 16, Oliver Mackey did dive into this one. That one does not hold 60 in its performance mode, which might be due to how the game is internally favoring its dynamic res and how the game just balances that versus the frame rate. So there are certain factors at play where the Pro is just simply not going to brute force every single example, but there are still a broad spectrum of games where you are seeing the frame rate go up by a considerable amount. So it's not like this Band-Aid fix for every single game. It seems like there are still some that are, a fringe case. We could probably just move right over to CPU-bound games as well, because that's the other aspect of Pro that we have to acknowledge. The console is has principally got the same CPU, but there is a setting developers can use which will boost it by 10%, just clock it 10% faster. So the weird thing here is they tested Cyberpunk 2077, and that did see a marginal improvement in frame rate, which does equate to about a 10% boost in that like market area. But that's an unpatched PS5 or no PS5 Pro patched game, I should say, right? So we don't really have the answer if like the boost setting when you're playing unpatched titles, if it will just by default utilize that 10% boost the CPU can use. It was my understanding that this was a developer thing studios could use and lean into if they're doing a proper PS5 Pro setting, not something the console will turn on in well, I guess light backwards compatibility. It's still playing PS5 software, obviously. One PS5 Pro patch game they did play, though, was Baldur's Gate 3, which, same thing here, a very CPU-bound game, so it's a modest bump in the frame rate, not at all close to 60, but it does show like a 5 to 10% improvement on average. So there are going to be, those examples, some CPU-bound games where there's just not really going to be a massive improvement. But it's there, so it helps. But in cases like Baldur's Gate 3, it's not getting anywhere close to the VRR window, at least not in like the super heavy scenarios. So it's just something to bear in mind as far as like how much value you place on what the console can do in the here and now. And it still does bode well for the future. Again, if you're not really into Pro or you just don't care, or obviously the price is super high, it does still speak a lot foundationally for where the console could go, or rather the platform that they're building for PSSR and what that could look like for PlayStation 6. So I actually want to use a quote here from their review where Richard Ledbetter says, and I quote here, "The idea of using more silicon for more GPU performance will never go away, but the rough doubling of GPU power moving from PS4 to PS4 Pro to PS5 simply isn't an option for console manufacturers anymore. Instead, expect to see machine learning make up the difference, working in tandem with fixed function hardware, improved RT support, for example. Based on the titles we've played so far with Pro support, that combination works well, and thus far, I do think that PS5 Pro does a much better job in enhancing current generation games than PS4 Pro did back in 2016. That is a fascinating conclusion Richard is coming to with this console, comparing it to PS4 Pro in that manner, because that has been, the talking point with this console, in that when you compare it to PS4 Pro, that console did represent a very unique time in that it did make sense with the mass adoption of 4K televisions. So there was this very tangible on paper thing you saw almost immediately when playing PS4 Pro enhanced games compared to the standard console. And so here it's like, okay, well, we already have a lot of games that are 60 FPS on the base machine. It's really a smaller list, a much smaller list nowadays for games that only have a capped 30 FPS mode and nothing else. Like, it's actually been a very unique thing now that this generation has seen the mass adoption from studios of finally offering performance settings on these consoles. And so PS5 Pro just doing more of that, in theory, has been the consternation among fans, is that, wow, it's not only a lot of money, so there's always that argument to be made versus PS4 Pro and how it slotted in at the same MSRP that the console launched at, but it still does represent, a talking point in that people don't really see the need for PS5 Pro in the same manner that PS4 Pro had in 2016. So for Richard to come to that conclusion, I think really does illustrate how much legwork this console is doing for existing software right now, either patched or unpatched, because it is a better experience. The weird thing here too is that, and this is what you don't want to do, but you don't want consumers to feel pressured to buy a $700 sort of low volume enthusiast box to guarantee those frame rates that they want out of these current generation games, because there are a lot of titles in this testing shows, it's like some games are just super unstable on the base console to where, like, yeah, we've got performance settings, but they're either taking way too many hits on the fidelity side to where the visual compromises are really starting to impede on the player experience, or you're not seeing like nearly stable 60 FPS modes, right? So you don't want to be in this position where it's like, okay, we have 60 FPS, but not really. So you feel that pressure of like, okay, to get that 95% of the time, I have to go out and buy a Pro. There's a lot of nuance to the conversation, I think. So at a certain point, we'll definitely do more of a like a long-term review, maybe after at least 2 weeks or something. I don't know what I plan on doing there, because initially we'll be doing just some standard out of the box, looking at the console kind of things initially. But yeah, that's a fascinating conclusion, which depending on what you value, you probably already have your mind made up on if PS5 Pro does make sense for you or not. Anyway, moving on to some smaller details for PS5 Pro. Number one, you can take 8K screenshots on the console for games that do support 8K, which there's actually some, not many, but it does. It is possible, I guess we could say. So there's that. You can take 8K screenshots. And then the other thing is on the Welcome Hub, where you can change a number of like dynamic backgrounds. PS5 Pro does have an exclusive one. Thought that was a nice little little touch there. It looks like it's got the very characterized version of the SoC, just kind of sparkling and everything. That's pretty sweet. I like that. It's almost something where maybe they could start doing that with I don't know, console covers or something, and they include like a little download code with the console covers, and you input that with your, your new Spider-Man 3 console covers, and then you get an exclusive Welcome Hub background or something. That might, in a way, be the trajectory we have as far as like customizing PS5 goes, is just the Welcome Hub in that one singular page where you can have that background be something and not any other portion of the console, which I'll always say, like, the console, all your games take up the background image, like the background are the games typically. And I actually do admire and enjoy that design principle, but I still get what people are saying with wanting the theme to just take priority over all images on the console. In the case of what's available on the console right now, though, the Welcome Hub does have one customizable area, so there is that. Maybe we'll see more of those pop up. All right, let's move on to some Sony financials. We've got their Q2 2024 financial report. This runs from July 1st to September 30th, and we now know within that time frame, Sony has shipped 3.8 million PS5 consoles, which is down from 4.9 million during the same period last year, but we are still in the back half of this console lifecycle, so we are expecting year-over-year declines, just a matter of how steep the drop-off is going to be. In this case, still doing reasonably well when launch aligned with PS4, so they're now up to 65.5 million PS5s shipped worldwide. As for the digital software ratio, that is now sitting at 70%. That's slightly up from last year, but down 10% from the outgoing quarter, so that does tend to fluctuate. Monthly active users also not fluctuating nearly as much. It's 116 million, so same as the last quarter, but that's also up from Q2 2023. As for operating income for the games and network services segment, this did really well. Sales are up 12% year over year, and operating income is 184% up as well, primarily due to what Sony says is an improvement in hardware profitability, non-first-party game sales, and sales from the network. They did revise their forecast for both sales and operating income, so that's both up as well. And we also found out that Astro Bot has now sold 1.5 million copies, an official number from Sony, in the first 9 weeks. So a very solid start for that game, and that is around the neighborhood I was expecting. It's the same talk we keep having here, which is a matter of how the game doesn't necessarily have to do 3, 4, 5 million, maybe lifetime it could get there, but in the sort of initial launch period, the weeks following, maybe right before the holiday season, I mean, I could see the game doing like a million plus, and that is exactly firmly where it is. And I think that's good news, because it is still the kind of IP that is not totally proven just yet. This is really the first time where it's a standard 2D premium Astro Bot game that people can go out and buy, and so I think we've got some pretty good results here. Now, there is one other aspect we can touch on here, which is the Sony CFO, Hiroki Totoki, talking about their plans for the games and network services segment, where they do confirm that they are planning to release major single-player games every year from next fiscal year onwards. So that would begin April 1st, 2025, and we already know that next year we are expecting at least Death Stranding 2 on the Beach, and then also Ghost of Yotei. Now, I wasn't able to catch a good portion of the Q&A and the actual earnings call and everything, so there's certain things that I probably have missed in relation to the company acknowledging what may or may not have happened with Concord. So investors were absolutely questioning the company there. I was not able to catch that portion of it. I believe they were like asked 3-4 times in a row or something regarding the closure. also the money that they spent on those games, which, I mean, I completely expect they were probably non-answers, so we might not even really be missing any news here per se. But we are, in that back half of the console lifecycle, so we are getting some more confident answers as far as the expectation for major single-player games now releasing. So the company does have that roadmap, and they are expecting that every fiscal year onward, we're now going to see some of those tentpole titles that they expect to be a very big portion of their bottom line. So that is something they'll be a lot more forward with, too, for every other subsequent financial report that we are going to go over. But in this case, the company's still doing reasonably well. PlayStation is doing good numbers for the company. Moving on to our next news story, it seems like we finally know about another Xbox Game Studios game coming over to PlayStation 5, and it's Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition. So this popped up where a screen was showing a lobby and there are some PS icons on a few users, so it seems like they might be testing the PlayStation 5 version. This was previously rumored from Tom Warren writing for The Verge, where this game in particular was being considered for an early 2025 release on PS5. So this probably is going to either be confirmed or just show up at some point. That is probably another Xbox Game Studios title showing up, and I know a lot of people love that franchise dearly. I mean, this game, well, Age of Empires 2, was on the PlayStation 2, so would be appropriate to have it come back on PlayStation 5 as well. Now, while we're talking about Xbox games coming over to PlayStation, we have the exact opposite happening, which does not really ever occur. And in this case, it's a really surprising, borderline shocking announcement, which is the shadow drop of Death Stranding Director's Cut right into the Xbox Marketplace, available on Series S, X, native ports. They're available. You can download them. The game's actually on sale, and it was published by 505 Games, same publisher for the PC version. And there's more to this because we also had a press release come out where Kojima Productions has confirmed they now own the Death Stranding IP. It's theirs. And there's more to this as well, because this was also on the 5-year anniversary of the game releasing originally on PlayStation 4, November 7th, 2019. So there is a lot to unpack on this, because now it's also something where, like, as far as IP ownership goes, this has always been, and with this game in particular, it's always been interesting seeing it play out over the years, considering we eventually got the PC version, but that was always outlined right away, and this kind of goes back to the original deal that Andrew House and Kojima had when they sat down and, got the deal done, and Kojima's firing up a new studio, and Sony bankrolled it, and typically back then that was when, for platform holders, and more so with Sony, if you were working with them, they were going to own the IP. So anyway, back then it was always well understood that the game was going to be PlayStation console exclusive, come to PC at a certain point, which obviously ended up happening. But the point is, that deal has always been a talking point of, like, what did they really sign on for? What can Kojima do? Does Sony really own the IP when we have all these weird things popping up where, like, oh, the PC version, which again, we knew that was going to happen anyway, but then you've got, like, the PC Game Pass deal. So there's always been a lot of consternation surrounding that deal. But we know Sony did own the IP for quite a long time. That was always easily verifiable, right? That was not surprising. You could just see that, not even from looking up trademarks, but just like legal copy on game trailers or store listings. It always said SIE trademark. But the thing is, now we can look back at Death Stranding 2 trailers, which are old and not updated and everything, and you can actually see on the bottom, it does say they're publishing that game, and that it's a trademark of Kojima Productions, which I'm trying to remember if we talked about that before. Surely we must have. It's starting to come back to me, but I can't remember what we said. I'm sure it might have been something where it's like, oh yeah, well, we know they own the IP. Here's all these other examples, but those other examples probably were like older director's cut trailers, and the second game is going to be more recent. So this maybe was in plain view that this was going to happen at a certain point. So I'm inclined to say that this was probably a part of the original deal, more so because of the 5-year thing. Right at 12 a.m. they launched the Xbox version. That is pretty damning evidence in that Kojima Productions knew this was coming up, and they had a decent amount of time to properly prepare the Xbox version and launch it as soon as they possibly could. And then again, having those DS2 trailers showing up with that updated legal copy as well. It sounds like that might have been an agreement that they made 5 years ago. That's not uncommon as far as I understand it. I mean, there's certainly deals where there's a transfer of IP ownership after a set amount of time. It does happen. Just we don't really see it that often in the games business, right? And it's like, okay, well, why now? Why would Sony agree to that? But context is everything. That's Hideo Kojima, a well-known, famed video game developer, leaving Konami, and now there's this golden opportunity where he's setting up a new studio, and it's like, oh, okay, you could bankroll that game. And if there were ever anybody in the games business where there's going to be some bargaining chips at play from the little guy in this case, that being Kojima, he's not really that little, but that's the point, is that he maybe can get away with the kind of agreement that maybe other studios wouldn't really be able to do. So that might have been a stipulation that he got, and now we're seeing it happen like 5 years later where it seems very surprising and shocking, but that might have been what played out. I'm not sure if it was maybe something where they were always planning on keeping the IP, but then they sold it back. In that case, I can still believe that happening too, just in that it's the same scenario basically, in that you don't want to be on the bad side of somebody you respect, have a good relationship with, that are still putting out high caliber games that do really well, and there is just a je ne sais quoi to Kojima, right? So it's like you want to keep that man happy. We already know they're also doing Phison as well at some point, and who knows what that's going to look like, and that's probably another console exclusivity publishing agreement or something, you have to imagine. It's always better for a lot of the studios and creatives to have their own IP anyway, because like 10 years ago, well, I say 10 years ago, that doesn't seem that long ago nowadays, let's say 15 something years ago, like this was always a very common thing for Sony where if they do any sort of deal, they own the IP. It was a very blanket, like publishers, platform holders, more so Sony, you are going to be signing away the rights to that game. So it's a lot different nowadays. Not only do they just sign on a bunch of smaller titles for PSN, Day 1 PS Plus titles, your Can of Bridge of Spirits or Stray or Bugsnax. I know I say these games all the time, but they're such good examples of like those games would have easily been like lockdown exclusives. Sony owns the IP on PlayStation 3. All day, every day they would have done that. But it's a lot more mutually beneficial to have this timed window agreement. The games go somewhere else. The developers still own the property, and that's good. And we see that they're now doing that with larger titles as well. Stellar Blade, Rise of the Ronin. It's just, in this case, it was a more unique thing we don't see too often. And if there were ever a person that is going to be able to arrange that kind of deal, it's probably Hideo Kojima. The other crazy thing too, I guess we could say, is like Decima Engine. Guerrilla's Decima Engine is now also on Xbox. That's crazy. It's so cool to see this play out. Because there's just so many weird things happening nowadays where it's like, yeah, the industry is certainly changing, and sometimes the seeds are planted years out and we don't see until very recently. With that in mind though, if you're on Xbox, play Death Stranding. I love it. It's such a quirky, unique, very bizarre game that I wholeheartedly enjoy, and now more people get to play it. Now, I feel like I would be remiss to not talk about Call of Duty Black Ops 6 because this is a very unique Call of Duty release in that it's the first year that the game is now available on Game Pass. There's also no marketing deal with PlayStation anymore because Microsoft now owns Activision Blizzard. So the entire, year and a half, 2-year process of the ABK acquisition, the back and forth, the documents, the court stuff that came out, the research and studies that were done about the influence of the franchise and what it could or could not do to PlayStation in the short to long term. Well, we finally have some real-world results for Call of Duty Black Ops 6, the first release out of this entire thing. So our first report comes from Christopher Dring of GamesIndustry.biz, where we have physical and digital sales data for the game in the UK, and sales were up 30% on PlayStation 5 and down 2/3 on Xbox. Across all platforms, PlayStation accounts for almost 75% of the sales in the UK. And as for the game itself, its sales are down 15% compared to MW3 and 46% from MW2. So just showing where the state of the franchise is right now. But unsurprisingly, the Xbox a la carte sales are down by a pretty substantial amount. On the flip side, we have engagement data coming from Matt Piscatella of Circana, and on October 28th, 52% of active Xbox Series players launched Call of Duty HQ, and 34% on PS5, both all-time highs for the game. So more people are, playing this game in particular, and there is that general uptick on Xbox with the availability now being on Game Pass. But the sort of short-term preliminary results is PS5 was not harmed, and I think that was going to be pretty clear in the first year. I would argue in the first few years, probably, if any harm would be done here. Although the weird spot Microsoft is now in is that your hardware sales are down year over year as well, so I would maybe make the case that you're not going to see anything substantial, if ever, for quite a long time. So it's pretty interesting how these things played out. I don't think any of us really knew for certain that this would be what would happen if we, talked about this 2.5 years ago when initially all this stuff went down. So it's some pretty fascinating early results, at least in the short term. There's been no major detriment to PlayStation sales, and in a way, people are still in droves going out to buy Call of Duty on PlayStation. The other little cool thing that we learned, I say cool as in like it's interesting to hear, 4% were on PlayStation 4, which is almost nothing. That kind of goes back to our conversation about PS4 sales in general, which is like the cross-gen period. It's financially a lot more advantageous and feasible to ship games on PS4 versus, again, from 2 to 3 or 3 to 4. But there is still that tipping point, 4%. At a certain point, like it's not worth it even in that case, right? Like people are still in droves buying PS5s, upgrading to PS5 as quick as they can, and buying PS5 versions of those games. And that was happening way earlier than people tend to think. So this should be the final year for Call of Duty on PS4. I would be baffled if we do get another year of Call of Duty on PlayStation 4. Even accounting for Nintendo Switch and the next-gen version of that hardware, which in theory might actually help PS4 versions in a way, but if people are just simply not buying PS4 software, it doesn't really matter, even if you're shipping a comparable version on some other system. The revenue still has to be there as far as like the resources that go into porting the game over, so I would be very surprised if we see another PS4 version. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all. And we had one Tuesday upload going over basically an office tour again, sort of updating you all on what's going on there, because I did have to rearrange a certain amount of games, move a column over, so I figured that's a good chance to just show you what's going on with everything right now. But now our PS5 Pro coverage begins, so I'm not sure at this point in time how many uploads we have and what's coming up tomorrow, but there should be more things coming out on a rolling basis, so we will have a lot of PS5 Pro stuff going on, and that's basically what this week is going to look like. The following week, we might have one or two other things that are unrelated to Pro, but that really depends on what I can get done in time. But that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.